gamers, Power Heal here, and today we're going to be talking about loot distribution for healers in World of Warcraft Classic. So if you have a loot council in your guild or a loot list or anything like that, and people are looking for advice in terms of like what should be available for who to put on their list, or what class should get what items in terms of loot council, feel free to direct them to this video, because that's going to be the point of this. We're going to be kind of looking in and taking a deep dive on the healer items, which is something that's a bit less common, I would say. And I think the reason for that is because most of the mental energy on a loot council obviously goes into, DPS upgrades, tank upgrades, right? And that's pretty logical, because obviously any type of tank upgrade is going to increase your threat, or tank's threat per second. It's going to increase the raid's DPS ceiling. And then for damage dealers, basically every point of damage matters, right? Where on healers, not every point of healing really matters. There's a ton of overhealing, right? There's a ton of times where your regen's not mattering a ton, unless you're like speed running or something. But outside of that, you're probably stopping and starting a lot. So those stats aren't always the best. And yeah, it's just the healer loot is a lot less effective. A lot of your power as a healer comes from your base, actually. The strength of your base heals, especially early on. Obviously, the more you get towards Nax, the more gear plays a part. But early on, especially, just having some prebis and a mix of like molten core items will pretty much let you heal pretty much anything in the game, outside of maybe like Naxxramas Saffron, and even something like that with world buffs is probably possible. So, with that being said, is there even a point to bother caring about how healer is distributed? And I would say yes, depending on the circumstances. So for a lot of the items, you're probably not going to have to really worry too much about who gets what, right? But there are some particular circumstances where if you know and you plan ahead, right, and you have an idea of what's available for certain classes down the line, then certain things just make a lot of sense. And they're completely logical, and you would basically do them all the time. And the only reason why you wouldn't have that type of distribution is if you weren't aware. And I feel like a lot of people aren't aware of certain things, so that's what the whole point of this video is for. We're just trying to bring kind of like obvious things to the table, so that people don't make like simple mistakes that kind of like screw over their raid, basically. So that's what we're really trying to do here. And I think the best way to kind of do that is we're going to build a foundation by talking about what I think each class, their kind of like functional role in the raid is, right? And then how that relates to like some of the stats on the gear. And then we're going to look at alternatives to gear, right? Because that's very important, what class has what for an alternative. And we're going to look at a special case for Horde as well, that we need to keep in mind on Horde side, which is why we're kind of doing a Horde side video. I think it's the most important. You might be able to do Alliance one in the future if people want to see that, but I think that this is the most pertinent one. So let's get right into the roles, right? So we're going to go class by class, Shaman, Priest, and Druid. And we'll start with Shaman. Shaman, your job is to just be an HBS pumper. Now, a lot of people in the healing space, they tend to view things through the lens of like healing assignments, right? Like, are you healing the tank or are you healing the raid? And I think that makes a lot of intuitive sense, but it can also cause some confusion, because if you're a shaman and you're being told to spam chain heal, right, you're going to be thinking, oh, I just want to heal the raid all the time. In reality, you can heal the tanks as well, obviously, right? And the tanks honestly make really good chain heal targets, assuming that the chain heal is still going to bounce to the melee and stuff like that, which is going to be the case in most fights. Because there's not a lot of fights where the tank is like off on their own island, so you can use chain heal on the tank very effectively in most situations. So what we're really talking about with shamans is, your role as a chain healer, basically. And if you're that chain heal person, the one guy who's just spamming chain heal, which is pretty much going to be every shaman unless you are a Earth Fury 8 out of 8 shaman, then you really, really want plus healing, right? And I'll take a moment to just talk about this Earth Fury 8 plus 8. So you're not going to have many of these in your guild. You might have like one or two. And basically, it's pretty simple. If you're going to have one of these guys, you want to give them all the Earth Fury, right? It's not very complicated. But the thing is, this set is not really good enough in any individual piece sense that, it would be unfair to like divvy it up, that you need to like divvy it up between certain players. In reality, it's just if somebody's going to play 8 out of 8, just give them the set, right? That's pretty much how it should be. Obviously, if you have multiple people wanting to do that, you're going to have to figure out a way to handle that. But that's like the first thing, is definitely give this to somebody who's planning on using it, because it's pretty decent, especially early on. I feel like it gets outscaled a bit later in the game, but if you're still in like Molten Core or something like that, then obviously this is something that's available to you as an option. But for the most shamans, they're going to be using Chain Heal pretty much all the time, which means they just want a ton of plus healing because Chain Heal has an insane spell coefficient, right? And shamans don't really do so well in other areas, right? They obviously have the quick heal, the instant heal, which is nice, but that's on kind of a long cooldown. They have lesser healing wave, right? Pretty equivalent to the priest's flash heal, but they don't have shield. They don't have any hots, right? Their mana regen also tends to be poor, so if they're using, a bunch of heals that they don't get a lot of return in terms of plus healing wise, right, then it's kind of like doubly bad for them, because it's like they're not getting much plus healing return when they could be using Chain Heal, which gives a lot of plus healing return, and they're using a lot of mana. So typically you want to have them be like the AoE spammers, right? They just do all the throughput healing in the raid, and you want to give them the plus healing gear. Now, Priest, in my opinion, is sort of almost like the opposite of Shaman, at least on Horde, right? Because on Horde, Priest is nowhere near close to fully unleashed because they don't really get to use their AoE healing, which would put them more on par with Shaman if they were an Alliance healer, right? Where they kind of want a bit more of that plus healing. But on Horde, they don't really get to use it. You're obviously doing a lot of dispels. You're actually doing more dispels than normal on Horde because there's less priests relative to the raid as a whole. So especially in an instance like MC, you're actually using the dispel key a lot compared to like an Alliance raid who has paladins who can dispel as well as priests, and they run more priests, right? So like basically everybody that's healing in the Alliance raid except the druid can dispel, and they run more priests. So yeah, it's just obviously you're gonna have to use way more mana on dispels Horde side. And then also, you're basically kind of like the jack of all trades as a priest on Horde, like you're the guy that's like saving people. You're doing the pre-shielding, you're doing the shielding in clutch moments, you're using flash heal to bail people out, you're doing some tank healing, you're kind of doing the dirty work. That is your job as a priest, and that just lends itself to not needing as much plus healing. It's pretty much that simple. We'll kind of talk more about that once we get into the specific gear pieces, but realistically, you don't really want to be absorbing tons of plus healing gear on the priest when there's other options available to you, right? Then going to Druid's an interesting case because there's a bit of a duality going on, where on one case, or on one hand, they're not actual like full-time healers, right? They're pretty much there for utility. They're giving their innovate in an efficient raid. They're spamming Fairy Fire and everything, right? They're not doing a ton of the actual healing in the raid. They're not being counted on to do like a lot of throughput. So right off the bat, you can kind of be like, well, since they're not doing a lot of throughput, why would we give them any healing items, right? Especially like the big ticket healing items that we kind of want to give shamans. And that is a reasonable take to have, but the one thing that makes it a bit awkward is that Druid, with the more plus healing, actually becomes way easier to play and way more effective. And why do I say that? Well, because rank 4 Healing Touch is actually an amazing spell. And basically how this works, right, is we're going to be talking about coefficients a little bit. We've already kind of talked about them in other videos, so you're probably familiar with them. But like I already mentioned that shamans have a really great coefficient on Chain Heal, right? And a lot of that comes from the fact that it's hitting multiple targets. So the coefficient is like split amongst the targets hit, and I think it totals up to like over 100%. So I think you're actually getting more than 100% of your healing, or it's like very close. It's like a lot, right? From when you're casting Chain Heal, assuming obviously it hits everything and there's no overhealing. Okay. Priest, obviously, like I said, you're kind of using a lot of your, spells that don't have great coefficients, right? Power Word Shield has a 10% coefficient. Flash Heal has a 0.4 coefficient, which is really not great, right? Even the spells that have a great coefficient, like Renew, really hard to use that spell. And then, obviously, your Prayer of Healing has a great coefficient, but you're not really using that much as a Horde side Priest. So, Priest, their coefficients aren't really that great, but Druid, has a fantastic coefficient. And the reason for that is because how the coefficients are calculated is basically the cast time of the spell, right? And there's also other factors, like is it an AoE spell, is it a single target spell? But let's compare like the Shaman's Healing Wave, the Priest's Heal, and then the Druid's Healing Touch, right? They're all functionally kind of the same spell, but the difference is that the Healing Touch on the maximum end has a higher cast time. Okay, so when you take the talent in each of these respective healers tree that lowers the lowers the cast time by 0.5 seconds on each of these, the Shaman has a 2.5 second healing wave, the Priest has a 2.5 second heal or greater heal, but the Druid actually ends up with like a 3-second healing touch. And because the base cast time is higher, the coefficient for the Druid is better. So on the Priest's most efficient basic heal, right, it's about 84% efficient, 84% coefficient, right, 0.84. For the Shamans, it's the same thing because they're both 2.5 second casts. For the Druid, it's actually 100%. So Healing Touch gives you 100% of your healing, which is quite good. And the really cool part about Healing Touch on Druid is there's a rank 4 Healing Touch, which is actually functionally amazing because it only has a 2.5 second cast time after you take the cast time reduction nodes in the resto tree, but it's still benefiting from that 3.5 second coefficient, right? So it still has 100% of your plus healing essentially, but the cast time is only 2.5 seconds. Also, you can reduce the mana cost on this substantially because you can get 9% reduced healing touch cost from the balance tree and then 10% from the resto tree for 19 total. This is if you play the Moonglow spec. And if you play the Moonglow spec, you can get Moonglow, which makes your next heal quicker if you've just crit. And you can get basically like 30-some% crit with world buffs, and some of the Druid gear has a little bit of crit on it. So, this class can actually put out some heals that are relatively quick in some cases, 2 seconds if you have the Moonglow buff to 2.5 seconds, that are, pretty mana efficient, right? And they can actually be quite chunky. Now, the problem, though, is getting the heal to that point, because the heal at base is about 390, I think, to 410, something about that. It's like 360, 380 to 4 something. The actual value doesn't really matter that much. It's basically around 400 healing per rank 4 healing touch, right? And that's taking 2.5 seconds to cast. So you're looking at that and you're like, wow, it's just terrible throughput, right? Because you're taking 2.5 seconds to cast and you're basically healing nothing. But once you start adding to that with plus healing, right, suddenly this heal becomes a lot better. And the idea is you just need to kind of get it to a bit of a sweet spot, right? You need to get it to a point where it's functionally useful. And once you get it there, then it kind of takes off and it's very useful. Because if it's at 400 to 600 plus healing, rather, not plus healing, if it's at 400, 600 healing, at that point, it's not even almost worth casting, right? But if you can get it to like 900 to like 1k, now you're putting a significant chunk back of people, right? For every heal cast. And the way you want to think of it is that people's health totals don't really grow a ton throughout the instances, right? Like your plus healing catches up to them much more than their health total grows on you, typically speaking. Now, for tanks in certain circumstances, this isn't quite true, but for most of like the DPS warriors and stuff like that, and most of the people in your raid, the health is going to grow relatively slowly. And if you get like, even coming out of Molten Core combined with Prebis, if you get like 600 plus healing, your healing touch is about basically hitting that like 1k-ish mark, right? And if you have full Blackwing Lair tier 2, which is very easy to get on like a druid because you have access to all tier 2 basically because there's only going to be one druid in the raid, just that would combine with some prebis, a decent weapon, especially now that we're going to have the rank 14 weapons available. You're going to have access to like a really strong healing kit, and it's basically going to be about like a 1k to 1.2k rank 4 healing touch, which is going to be absolutely amazing and super mana efficient, and you're going to be able to do a lot of work in a raid with that. It's going to be like your workhorse, right? And as long as like you're good at predicting damage and you're not very wasteful and you're not just like spam casting everywhere, you can be like a super efficient player using this heal. And the thing is, that's only really unlocked though if you allow this class to have gear. Now luckily, like I said, the class inherently gets a lot of gear because the tier sets are healing sets. Okay, so tier 1 and tier 2 both are healing sets, and they're both pretty decent. Piece for piece, you can make an argument for pretty much just using the healing set, or the tier set rather, over other pieces of gear. So that's something to keep in mind, and we'll be looking at that when we're comparing items going forward. So that's basically the like an overview of all the classes and kind of like their role. And now we're going to talk about the kind of like the Horde exception is what I'd call it. Why am I making this video about Horde, right? Why is it more important to talk about Horde than Alliance, right? And that is basically because we have to look at AQ40 over here, right? So we're coming into AQ40, and we go over here, and we look at the Shaman, right? Where is it here? Okay, and you'll notice the 5 set is minus 0.04 on chain heal. Okay, we already covered chain heal is pretty much going to be where you want to be spamming unless you're the 8 out of 8 tier 1 Shaman, right? And this is just like an amazing set bonus. And there's a little bit of debate in the Shaman community about whether you want to use this or you just want to go like standard, right, and have more plus healing. In my opinion, this is just unequivocally the better option, is running the 5 out of 5 Stormcallers. You know, I think when you're in full Nax gear, then obviously there's a bit of a more like it's more competitive, right? Obviously at that point, but until you get into basically like close to full Nax gear, or you have like a lot of Nax gear, this is the preferred option for Shamans. Now, some people will be like, oh, you know, just having fill in with the other gear is better. I feel like that's pretty much cope, though, and realistically, if everybody could have this, they would. It's just that, like, there's obviously a limited availability of the tier tokens and stuff like that. I believe some of the pieces get shared with Warrior, but I don't really think they're the amazing pieces. I think Warriors tend to want, like, the shoulders, right? I know the chest is shared with Warriors, I believe. Yeah, Shaman. Oh, no, yeah, Shaman right here. But people don't really want the chest, right? And then you're not really going to have many rogues, I feel like, in a really high-end raid. So check out some of these. Nope, that's not one. I think it's like shoulders, right? Okay, no, so the warrior shoulders don't even share with that. Yeah, so basically, you know, the shamans are probably going to get a lot of these tokens on Horde side, but there's still going to be sort of a limited amount, right? So you're not going to be able to outfit everybody in 5 out of 5 right off the bat. And unlike tier 3, which you only need 3 pieces of, you actually need all 5 of these, obviously, to get the set bonus of Shaman. So it makes it a bit more difficult because it's not really worth using these pieces until you get 5 out of 5. So typically what guilds will do is they will mark Shamans to get these pieces, right? And they'll be like the tier 2.5 Shamans or whatever, right? And you'll normally have like 1 or 2 of them at least at first, and then you'll kind of add to that as you get more gear. But this is very important because this is going to affect loot distribution, even going back to Blackwing Lair, right? Because you'll notice that there is a helmet, feet, a chest, legs, and pauldrons. So you're probably already thinking of a couple items that you can't use with this set, and that's pretty important. So we'll actually go back to Molten Core, and we'll look at Major Domo, right? And the first item that kind of comes to mind is these Wild Growth Spalders. And this is why technically, like, you really would want to start min-maxing your loot distribution, even in Molten Core, right? Because you can look, the drop rate on these isn't that great. And, you know, if a shaman picks these up, that is then going to be the 5-piece 2.5 shaman, right? It's going to be basically a waste, right? Now, the one caveat here is you're going to be clearing Molten Core for a while. You're basically going to, it's the starter raid, right? And you're still clearing it while you're doing Blackwing Lair. And then once AQ40 comes out, even if your guild drops it, you can still pug it and like hard res this, right? Or soft res it, depending on your situation. So you are going to have a lot of opportunities to get these, which is why I feel like these shoulders are not like that big of a problem if, you know, you don't get them. The annoying thing though is that on Shaman, they are like much better than your tier shoulders, right? So it's like, you know, missing all the healing does kind of stink if you can't get them, but you do have a lot of opportunities to get them. So that's something to keep in mind. Like, don't give these to somebody who is eventually going to want the 2.5, okay? Or at least don't give them to them first, obviously. If you have enough to go around, then feel free. But I think that the order on these should basically go to Shaman, who isn't going to use the tier 2.5 right away, then Druids, and then obviously Shamans who have the tier 2.5, who are going to be going for the tier 2.5 but don't have it yet, right? So that's my thoughts on these. And then we're going to hop into Blackwing Lair. And we're gonna cover all the pieces, right? Potential pieces and all of the kind of like loot conflicts. But this is the one I wanted to mention first because it's very pertinent for Horde side. And it's going to be Boots of Pure Thought. So as you can see, this is another slot that's taken up by the 5-piece from AQ, the 2.5. And if you, give this to a shaman who's going to be using the tier 2.5, it's basically like you've deleted these boots, right? It's just a complete waste, and these are actually quite rare. And they don't have like a boss that they drop off of specifically every week, right? Now, they do drop off the trash, but they only drop off the trash right after Veil, I believe. They don't drop off any of the other mobs like later in the instance. So these are actually very rare because there's very few mobs that can actually drop them, and there's still other things on the table, I believe. It's not just the boots there. So squandering these is really annoying. That being said, I do think that they are good on Shaman, assuming that you're not going to use the tier 2.5 set, right? They're still most effective on Shaman, again, because they have the most amount of plus healing, and we really want plus healing on a Shaman over everything else. So I would say Shaman who, isn't going to use the tier 2.5, then the prio is Druid, right? Because Druid really wants the plus healing as well, and also they make use of the Spirit. Fantastic, right? Then Priest last. And this is coming from a Priest player. And I know this is a really sought-after item, so Priest players might be upset, but it's just not the best on Priest. Now, obviously, you don't have to always distribute things by which is what thing is going to the absolute, class that can use it the best, right? And in a lot of cases, people don't really do that just to avoid kind of like loot drama and stuff like that, right? Because it never feels good to kind of be like, oh, you can't roll on this item that is actually kind of good for you. So this is kind of just like going to be guidelines. And the main thing I want you to take away from this video is just don't give stuff like this to a shaman who is going to go tier 2.5, because at that point you're just wasting it, right? And there's one more other like a really big example of this that we're going to get into later in the video. But, for the most part, those are the things I want you to take away. So let's go through the pieces here, and we're going to talk about like where things should go for certain classes. And we're going to do this by basically comparing it to other things the class has available, as well as comparing it to like what the class wants to do in the raid, right? So these gloves are just complete trash. Shamans don't want Spirit. They don't have any plus healing on them. Druids don't want them because there's no plus healing on them. And even for Priests, the Priest tier 1 gloves are better. If your Priest has like terrible gloves, I guess, they can get these, but these are pretty much going to be shard tier. This mantle is actually going to be good for healers after the DPS get it, because it's best for a lot of the DPS, I believe. So, I mean, in some cases, if you get a ton of these, your priest can get them. But outside of that, it's probably not going to go to healers at all. Shamans obviously have the shoulders that we just showed, and so do druids. So that would be a priest item. Coming into Veil, obviously Red Dragon Scale Protector is only going to go to shamans, right? Because they're the only ones who can use it. Very simple. I will make a comment about shields in general. I think shields are very underrated. If you give me a choice between this and the AV offhand, I pick this 100% of the time. The real problem, though, becomes, do you want to sacrifice a loot prio on it? And I think if you're like a guild master, if you're somebody who does loot for your guild, I think penalizing somebody super heavily for using this item or taking this item is generally bad. It's kind of just like almost like a free roll item that whoever gets it just benefits from it. The one thing I will say is, if you're going to give it to somebody and they're going to use it for PvE and PvP, that's the person I would give it to first. If somebody's just going to use it for PvP, it kind of doesn't really matter what shield they use, I feel like, right? I would rather somebody who's actually going to use this like in the raid, and also PvP with it, right? So just something on that, but this is an underrated item, I think. And then in terms of the pendant here, this is an item that I would give to priest. Why? Because for druid and shaman, you really just want the strat neck or any neck that has plus healing on it. Because again, on a shaman, plus healing is just incredibly strong for you. And then on a druid, you really don't want to miss an entire slot and not have plus healing on it, right? Because again, remember, we're trying to crank that rank for healing touch to a usable level, and then like a strong level. And this just isn't helping with that at all, right? And obviously the regen and not the plus healing goes way better into the priest wheelhouse. So coming into the third boss, none of these items here are healer items, right? And then it's just all tier. And then obviously this is a fire resist item. Nothing to see here. This is basically functionally the same item from Dire Maul East if you just care about healing, right? I think the other one has like 1 more MP5, 1 less healing, and 3 less intellect. It doesn't have the stamina on it. So realistically, there shouldn't be a fight over this at all. And keep in mind, shamans and druids both get Core Leather Belt, which they should be using because it's obviously really strong for them. It's like the most plus healing per slot that they can get, or in that slot that they can get, right? So that's something to keep in mind there. Going to the ring here, right? This is something that I think should go to priest. Most likely, a lot of people aren't going to be really rolling on this, but if healers were rolling on it, I would give it to priest over shaman or druid, just because, again, shaman and druid want to have the most plus healing possible on their rings. Now, at this point in the game, it's going to be kind of like, hard for people to have like really good rings. So you may have a case where somebody has kind of like a bad ring, and you just give them this regardless of the class. That's fine. But, just talking generally speaking, I think it's probably best on priest. Shadowing Focus Staff. So this is an item that, obviously priests aren't going to use this because they have Benediction, right? Shamans and druids, realistically, a lot of people are probably just going to go rank 14. But if you're not rank 14, then this is like an okay, druid item, I guess, if casters don't want it. The problem really, though, is that if you get the AV offhand, which everybody can get, right, and then you pair it with basically any main hand, that's going to be better for your purposes than using this for like most classes, right? So it's basically like you have to think of it as you could use the AV offhand with a main hand that gives like 30 healing if you get the hammer from BRD. So you're basically always sacking 30 healing, and you're sacking 30 healing for 40 int, which is quite a lot of int, But if I was a class, like, I would actually probably give this to Shaman over a Druid, only because I care less about the int on a Druid, because I'm not going to be, like, ooming as much on a Druid, right? Shamans really burn through mana, so having the extra 40 int can actually be somewhat helpful in itself. You know, and if you're going to be able to remax your mana throughout a dungeon. But on Druid, you just don't really care about having the extra intellect as much because, you know, your spells are really cheap and you're mostly just casting Fairy Fire and stuff like that. So that's my thoughts on that. This is not really a super contested item, though. I don't think this is going to be a big problem to dole out in Loot Council, and this shouldn't really count against people that much, like, prio-wise, if they get something like this, because it's not very good. So Rejuve Gem, this is kind of like the star of the show, right, in Blackwing Lair. And my order on this is I think it's just best on Shamans, obviously, right? And then I think it's best on Priest after that, and then Druid following. Now, part of me wanted to put Druid ahead of Priest, but I think there's a couple problems with that. So it's very clear, like, why Shaman is the best, right? Just a fantastic plus healing trinket, good mana regen, right? So great for a Shaman. The problem with putting Druid ahead of Priest is twofold, right? The first is that you run into that problem where, again, Druids are not a primary healer, and even if you don't want to consider Priests like the primary Horde healer, they're still more of a primary healer than Druid is, right? So there's that, where they're just going to be casting more heals generally. But then also beyond that, you have to compare what trinkets are going to be available for classes, right? And I actually really like using the Blue Dark Moon card on Druid, which is going to be available in the Blackwing Lair phase. The reason why is because you're going to be casting a lot of instant cast Fairy Fires, right? And that has a great chance of proccing the trinket, right? So yeah, it's just like a no-brainer, I think, to use that trinket on Druid. And then your Dire Maul trinket is actually quite good on Druid. It's plus 44 healing, and it kind of, like, you know, maximizes the effect that we want. We want as much healing as possible. We don't really care about regen as much, right? And that's what the trinket does. And those trinkets combined are very good on a class that's basically like a utility healer, if that makes sense, right? So it's like you could give Druid Rejuve Gem, but realistically, you're now sacrificing giving it to a Priest or a Shaman for plus 20 healing, right? I was actually given this, ironically enough, in Psalm on my Druid, but it was basically given to me as like a token of appreciation because I didn't get much loot, right? And that's something that is a lot of times a factor in loot, especially for healer loot, because it doesn't quite matter as much, right? So, you know, at the end of the day, it feels kind of bad, and people might get upset if, you know, priests aren't considered in the prio for this, or if druids aren't considered in the prio. But and if that's okay, you know, like if you want to like run your guild where, you know, you throw somebody who's been like really loyal a bone every once in a while, even though it's not the most efficient thing to do, I think that's absolutely fine. I think keeping people happy is a skill set in itself in guild management and running a guild, so I would not fault you for that whatsoever. I'm obviously just trying to provide you with the best use case for the item, but that doesn't mean, you know, you have to abide by that at all times. So that's my thoughts on Rejuve Gem. Going into Ebon Rock here, nothing changes, right? Nothing here for healers. Shroud of Pure Thought, this is like kind of like a throwaway item because most of your healers are either going to have, like, they probably bought Hide of the Wild because they didn't listen to my video, XD. Just kidding. Or they're going to have like the Dire Maul cape or something like that. So this isn't like a huge upgrade, and you can really just kind of give it to anybody. I think it's probably best on priests, again, just because there's a little bit less plus healing on the top end and it's more regen focused. But again, doesn't really matter too much where you give this. Going into Chromagus, you'll see this is an item, I feel like, unfortunately, it kind of seems good on the surface. It's kind of like a bait. It's kind of nice in the sense that, you know, it is like just a leather item that you can get if you have like nothing else in the slot. But really, on both Druid and Shaman, you really need plus healing on every piece if you can, right? So just not the fact that this has no plus healing is just really bad. It's particularly bad for a druid, I feel like, because you have very easy access to your tier, which has like 40 some healing plus 1% crit. And again, we don't really care about mana regen as much as on druid, right? In terms of when we're comparing it to plus healing, like you mentioned, or I mentioned that I use Dark Moon card, or I'm thinking of using Dark Moon card blue on druid, right? But the reason is because that's like a one trinket slot that provides a huge benefit mana regen wise, right? So trading one trinket slot where you're going to have a mediocre plus healing trinket in there anyway for a huge amount of mana regen, right? Considering how druid like functionally uses their spells, that's worth it to me. Trading a glove slot where you're getting like potentially 40 some healing on the glove slot and you're trading it for what 6 MP5, that's not great. So yeah, I wouldn't use this basically at all. This item, obviously priests get this a lot just for like knacks for the stupid mind control. And these items are kind of interesting. So I'll start with this one first since it's less controversial. I think this item should be given to priests basically, especially if you're going to not give them the other boots, like the trash boots over here, the Pure Thought. These obviously fit more into like what priest is trying to do, especially on Horde side, right? Because it's more dispelling, which doesn't require plus healing. It's more using the more inefficient or the heals with the worst coefficient, right? Which again don't benefit as much from plus healing. So if you really want to min-max, I think shamans and druids get the Pure Thought. Priests get the Shimmering Geta now. A lot of priests probably aren't going to want the Shimmering Geta, but they are much better, in my opinion, than like your Prophecy boots or something, because at that point, you're dealing with such a small amount of plus healing loss that, especially for like if you're doing any type of speedrunning or quick clear, where you're not able to stop and remax your mana, having the regen is going to be more beneficial to you over the long term. So that's how I feel about these boots. The empowered leggings, these are interesting. When people look at these at first, they think priest because of the spirit and because they're default cloth. But I feel like that's just kind of like a misnomer. Like people really overvalue spirit on priest, and people are very allergic to like if there's one stat on an item that a class can't use or something, people are very hesitant to give that class the item, which sort of makes sense logically because they're like, oh, well, the item budget must be like tied up in that stat. But Spirit seems to have like a very poor item budget. So even when there's like a decent amount of Spirit on an item, it tends not to like eat up most of the budget because this item, even outside the Spirit, is quite good, right? I think giving this to a shaman, for example, is fine. The one thing about it is that a lot of shaman probably aren't really going to want it because a lot of shaman do like to have the tier 2 pants as part of their 3 set, right? And most of that is just because we've obviously had Molten Core out for longer than Blackwing Lair, so it's easier to get that. So that's pretty much like one of the pieces that they do have, right? But if they are able to, get away with not using the tier 2 pants, then these are actually pretty damn good on a shaman. The one thing, again, you want to be careful with these is like you don't want to give these to a shaman who is going to be using the 2.5 in a queue, because obviously then they're just a completely wasted item. So that's another thing to just be worried about here, right? These are actually very great on Druid. The problem with the Druid and Shaman on these, right, and to a lesser extent, I guess, Priest, and the reason why I'm actually kind of probably very in favor of giving these to Shaman, is that both Priest and Druid have, like, identical tier 2 legs that are amazing, right? They're basically like those Dire Maul legs, the ones that we covered, the Padres trousers, except they're both a better version of it with more stats, right? So they both have like 40-some healing, 6 MP5, 20-some spirit, and 20-some stam. 20-some int. So just fantastic legs, and you're not really gaining a ton by upgrading to empowered leggings on either of those classes. I feel like on Priest in particular, These aren't really that great on a priest because tier 2 legs are just really good for the entire game in terms of maintaining your 3 set. And you could kind of make the same argument for druid. When you want to break the rest of the tier 2 up later, the tier 2 legs are one of the stronger pieces. So yeah, I think giving these to priest is probably the worst. Obviously, outside of giving it to a shaman who's not going to use them because they get the tier 2.5, right? So no shaman with tier 2.5, then no priest. Then think about giving them to the shamans that aren't going to have the 2.5, then the druids. I would put them about kind of like equivalent. I'd maybe give the edge to a shaman because, again, just the druid legs are better. Also, you have to keep in mind that the druid gear is not going to be, it's probably going to drop a lot, right? And it doesn't have any other place to go, right? So druids basically get their legs for free. Shamans don't, right? So that makes this pretty much a shaman item, I feel like, by default. And that's going to be the case for a lot of items that I feel like druid could get otherwise, right? Like, that's another fantastic case for giving the Boots of Pure Thought to a shaman over a druid, because druid, if you look at their boots here, they're not bad, right? They're not really good, but they're not bad. They do have the crit on them. This is kind of like the one area where I do think that, like, you know, obviously druid gains a lot just from getting a lot of their items for free, but if you did want to throw the druid a bone, the Boots of Pure Thought are kind of like a decent bone to throw because it is a substantial amount of healing over the tier 2 boots here, right? But for most other things, like we just kind of went over here, right, it's not anywhere near as good to have these. It's just that the tier 2 on the druid is so good. But, you know, this is another case where I could throw the bone to the druid. So it's kind of a toss-up here. And we're getting too into the weeds on this item, so we'll move on. But I would say shaman or druid here for sure. So coming into Nefarian, now this is like where the... but we'll start with Locomir here because I feel like there's a golden rule that needs to be followed when divvying out Locomir, which is never give this to a priest. It is just trolling to give this to a priest. Now, again, a lot of these problems are probably going to be abated in this version of the game because a lot of people are probably going rank 14, and this just becomes a non-factor because the rank 14 mace is better. But if they're not going rank 14, definitely don't give it to a priest. In my opinion, Benediction is actually, it's like arguably better than this plus the AV offhand. Some people would disagree on that. It's like very close either way, right? You're basically trading some intellect for some plus healing, and there's crit on the Benediction and stuff like that, right? So it's just a complete waste because priest gets the item for free, and you really have to take that into account, right? Like, a priest is already going to have Benediction in most cases, or if they're not, it's going to be a 50-50 shot each week that they get it going forward, and you're giving a relatively rare item to a class that already has like an equivalent, which is Terra bad, right? So you pretty much always give this to shaman or druid, and I think it's pretty decent on either one. Obviously, like I said, shaman just tends to be your primary healer, so you tend to just give them more healing upgrades overall. But yeah, going down, I'm going to talk about Mish last. Obviously, it's not like a healing item per se, but sometimes you end up getting extra of these, so there's a couple cases I want to mention. But we'll go into Pure Elementium Band first. So this is another one of those items where it's kind of like an iconic item from Blackwing Lair. It's kind of like the Rejuve Gem, where a lot of times guilds just kind of give it out to people that are like loyal to the guild and stuff like that, right? But I think realistically, there is kind of a good way to do rings, and I would put it like this. So what we're going to do is we're going to take a look one phase ahead, right, to Zul'Grub, and we're going to look at the ring 2 set here, which we can find in a moment. Okay, so this is basically like 29 healing for this ring with 12 intellect and 8 spirit, which just comes out to be like, kind of like round this up to like 2 MP5, right? And then the other... you're going to have your 3 set, keep in mind. The other ring, if we can find it here, is 6 MP. So it's like 8 MP5, like 22 intellect, and then about like 30 some healing per ring, right? That's pretty good. If we compare that to like, let's go back to Molten Core for a moment, right? And we'll go to like double cop bands, right? So you're gaining basically like 15 healing per ring. You have the same intellect basically, right? And then you're gaining 8 MP5 from the... So it's basically like you're trading 8 MP5 for like 30 healing, right? And on a priest, like I'd kind of do that all day. Even if you disagree that, like even if you value the healing more, I think you can't really argue around that it's better to have the MP5 over the healing on the priest than it would be on another class, right? Like on a druid, you want the plus healing. On a shaman, you really want the plus healing. On a priest, you're more okay with getting the regen. So for this reason, I think actually, if you're really trying to min-max, you really don't give the epic rings to priest at all. And what you do is you give, you let the priest scoop up the ZG tier 2 set, right? And then shamans and druids, you basically just give them the other rings here. Now, I actually think if you're trying to throw a druid a bone, right, in addition, like the pure thought boots are a decent idea. Again, the pants are like okay, but the ring from Nefarian here is actually quite good on druid because again, we're trying to get the most plus healing possible for our rank 4 healing touch, and we get 10 spirit, which basically converts to like 2 MP5, right? So yeah, I think this is a pretty strong druid item. I mean, it's also great on a shaman. The thing is, realistically, you're kind of giving this out to people who, you know, don't have like another great ring equivalent, right? So the problem is, it's like, are you really going to give it to a druid over a shaman who has, maybe he has his forging ring, and then he has like his BRD quest ring, and he hasn't gotten a cop band, and this drops, and it's like, are you really going to give it to a druid over him? I mean, you could, but it's also great on the shaman, right? So kind of like equal prio with shaman. Like technically the stats benefit druid more, but again, assuming the shaman has like bad rings, then this is going to benefit the raid more being on a shaman. If the shaman has kind of like good rings already, like if he has one cop band, I say give it to the druid, because the forging seal with a cop band is like fine for the shaman. But if they have like a really low plus healing ring and forging seal, then yeah, I could see giving this to a shaman for sure. So yeah, that's my thoughts on these rings. And like typically how I think you want to do this is you almost want to give pairs of these to people, and then the other people should get the ZG rings, whether that be a priest or another class, which sounds kind of messed up, I guess, because it's like, wow, why would you be giving this healer like 2 cop bands or 2 whatever, right? But it actually is just more efficient to do that, because the problem is if you have a cop band, right, and you have kind of like a crappy ring, it's like you kind of want to just get the ZG 2 set, because remember, we compared 2 cop bands, okay, to the ZG 2 set, and we said for priest it's probably like unequivocally better. Like, or, well, at priest it's about equal. You could argue that it's actually better to have the ZG2 set. You could argue it's a bit worse. For other classes, maybe it's a little better to have the 2 cop bands, right? But realistically, if you have 1 cop band, you're kind of in this awkward spot where now you have like 1 cop band and like the forging seal. And at that point, it probably is just better for you to run the ZG2 set on any class than being a 1 cop band or 1 pure elementium ring and then a forging seal. So it almost is like better if you give 2 epic rings to people, you know, and then they have a reason. Then it's like, okay, like we have no reason to run the ZG2 set, right? And it sounds a little messed up. I think that is actually like the most efficient way to do it. And you just gear everybody else out with the ZG2 set until more rings drop. The ZG2 set is like amazing. We'll make a whole video on that and how amazing it is, even though a lot of that probably has been hashed out in this video already. But yeah, that's my thoughts on the rings. It's probably kind of controversial, and a lot of people probably aren't going to do that because it would upset people, but I think that's like the most efficient way to do it. Kind coming back to Mish, so obviously this is not going to go to healers unless, casters have it, but it's actually quite good on all of the classes. It's better than the priest tier 2 helm, in my opinion, because it's actually kind of good on priest because you're casting a lot of flash heals, and having the extra crit to get the armor bonus proc is always nice, right? Then if we go over to Shaman, the crit is just really good, and their helm kind of sucks anyway, right? The only helm that I think is like truly really good for Shaman outside of this in this phase is the one from Azuragos, which is obviously insane, but it's hard to get. So this is actually a great Shaman option. And I think, honestly, I would prefer to see it on the Shaman than the Priest, just because the Priest tier 2 helm is better, right? And the Shaman tier helm is worse. And this is great on a Druid too, because Druids really like crit. Even if they're just going Moonglow, they like crit. If they're going Regrowth Spec, they like crit. It's very comparable to the tier 2 helm, but that's also kind of the problem with giving it to Druid, is that, again, Druid gets their helm uncontested, and it's just a really good helm, right? Kind of like with the Druid pants. Like, you get the pants uncontested, and they're really good pants. So when a class is getting something uncontested, it's really hard to make the argument of giving them something else, right? And that's why I think out of everything, Pure Elementium Band and the Boots of Pure Thought are kind of like the two items that you would throw to a Druid's way, right? Because in the Pure Elementium's Band case, there's no alternative. Like, they don't get an item for free there. And then in the Boots of Pure Thought case, it is just much better than the Druid's tier boots, as the tier boots tend to be like one of their worst pieces, right? So yeah, I think that we just disappeared, but pretty much the video's ended anyway. It was actually kind of like perfect timing. So yeah, I think that's basically everything. I don't think I left anything out. I think we covered like all the items there basically. And yeah, probably in a lot more detail than we needed to, but that's a Power Word Heal video. So I hope you guys enjoyed this. And yeah, just if your loot council feels like listening to a rant about healing items, send this their way. I'll talk to you guys next time. And